Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a philosopher or a king, but with something far more dangerous and complicated. Dating in the Middle Ages, because, believe it or not, finding love in a time of plagues, dowries, and chaperones was somehow even more awkward than texting someone, "What you doing?" at 2 a.m., from courtly love songs to marriage by livestock negotiation. Medieval romance was less about butterflies and more about land rights. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you're standing in a medieval village, or maybe a chilly stone castle, wondering how to find love. Maybe strike up a conversation, compliment someone's hose, ask if they come here often. Nope, that's not how any of this works. If you're in the Middle Ages, dating in the modern sense doesn't really exist. You don't flirt, text, or go for long walks to see where it goes. Instead, your parents, or your lord, or your abbot are already deciding who you'll marry, when, and how many cows it will take to seal the deal. If you're a noble, you've probably been betrothed since before your voice dropped. You and your future spouse might meet for the first time on your wedding day, and yes, that's just as uncomfortable as it sounds. The whole thing is about land, titles, and family alliances, not compatibility or how good they are at lute solos. The goal is to merge two powerful families, secure borders, and ensure the continuation of a bloodline. Your personal feelings are, at best, a secondary concern. If you're a peasant, things are slightly less formal, but only slightly. Your family still has a strong say, and love isn't really part of the discussion. Maybe your parents know a nice girl whose family owns a productive goat. Maybe they admire a boy who can thatch a roof without falling off. Boom, you're courting now, lucky you. The primary concern here is practicality. Can this person help run the farm? Are they healthy enough to produce children who will also work the farm? It's a pragmatic, survival-based decision. It's not that people in the Middle Ages didn't feel romantic love. They absolutely did. The poetry and songs of the era are filled with passionate, often tragic, expressions of love. However, this kind of love was seen as something separate from marriage. Falling in love before marriage, that's risky. Falling in love outside of marriage, that's scandalous. Either way, it's frowned upon, unless you're a character in a tragic poem, in which case, go wild. For most people, love was a luxury, while a good marriage was a necessity. And yet, you dream. Maybe you write a little verse on a scrap of parchment you can barely afford. Maybe you sneak a glance across the market square, hoping for one in return. Maybe, just maybe, you fall for someone who wasn't pre-approved by your family's livestock appraiser. The human heart has always been rebellious, and the strict social rules of the time couldn't entirely extinguish the spark of personal desire. But for now, you wait, you obey, you try not to fall for the miller's apprentice, because in this world, love might be the goal of poets, but marriage is the work of parents, priests, and politics. You focus on your duties, push down your feelings, and hope that the partner chosen for you is at least kind, and maybe doesn't have a hacking cough that signals an early demise. In medieval Europe, your romantic life is not your own. So, you think someone's cute? Maybe it's the way they balance a basket of onions on their head. Maybe it's the confident way they beat mud off a rug. Your medieval heart skips a beat. But steady yourself, because in this world, romance doesn't bloom without a balance sheet. Before you even think about courtship, you'd better ask, what do I bring to the table? And if your answer is just a charming personality, you might want to sit down. If you're a young man, you'll need land, or livestock, or tools, or a roof that doesn't leak too much. Love letters are nice, but nothing says husband material like 2 healthy oxen and a thatch that can survive a mild storm. Your worth is measured in your ability to provide and protect. If your father has already promised the best goat to your older brother, leaving you with little more than a rusty spade, you might want to consider the priesthood. Your romantic value is directly tied to your economic prospects. If you're a young woman, your family needs a dowry. This could be coin, clothing, household linens, or a suspiciously generous number of geese. It doesn't matter how witty you are or how beautifully you sing. If your family can't provide a respectable dowry, you're likely to spend a long time perfecting your embroidery alone. The dowry was a fundamental part of the marriage negotiation, representing your family's status and their contribution to the new household. A small dowry meant a small pool of potential suitors. Now, let's say you actually like someone who makes your calloused heart flutter. You lock eyes at the well. There's a spark. It's romantic, it's poetic, it's completely irrelevant. Because unless your families are on an equal financial and social footing, you might as well fall in love with a cloud. Marrying above or below your station was incredibly rare and often led to social ostracization for everyone involved. For the nobility, it gets even worse. Your hand in marriage is a political tool tied to land borders, military alliances, and strategic favors. You're not just a person. You're a walking treaty. Congratulations. A marriage could end a decades-long feud between 2 families or secure a vital trade route. Your personal happiness is a footnote in the grand ledger of dynastic politics. Even peasants aren't safe from this pragmatism. Marriage is practical. You don't marry for butterflies. You marry because your pigpen borders someone else's wheat field, and combining them would be efficient. You dream of passion, but you settle for better irrigation rights. This practical approach ensured the stability and survival of the community, even if it stifled individual romance. And yet, you try. Maybe you offer a small gift, a carved spoon, a handful of wild berries, or your finest, slightly cracked mug. Maybe they smile, maybe they don't, but the truth remains. In medieval dating, economics is the language of flirting, and genuine love is just a bonus you hope your spouse develops eventually. Somewhere between the 3rd child and the seasonal plague outbreak. So let's say you're not a peasant worrying about pigs, or a noble dealing with treaties. Let's say you're a knight, shiny armor, big horse, questionable poetry skills. What's your love life like? Welcome to the strange and emotionally exhausting world of courtly love. Now, this isn't dating. This is performance art. Courtly love was a noble pastime, part flirting, part spiritual suffering, and entirely impractical. You, the brave knight, choose a noble lady, usually one who's already married and of a higher social standing, and vow to adore her from afar. The key here is from afar. Physically acting on this love would ruin everything. No, you're supposed to suffer, but elegantly. This suffering was meant to ennoble you, to make you a better, more virtuous knight. Your devotion was a testament to your character, not a prelude to an actual relationship. Your primary duty in this arrangement is to pine. You might compose a few tortured verses about her silver laugh, or how her hair burns like the sun, which, in medieval terms, means she has hair and hasn't insulted your family. You wear her colors at tournaments. You sigh dramatically during feasts. You occasionally joust someone just because he glanced at her for a moment too long. It is a public display of private devotion, understood by all as a sophisticated game. The lady's role in this performance is just as prescribed. She's supposed to pretend this is all very flattering, while maintaining a level of icy detachment that would terrify a glacier. She is the unattainable ideal, the source of your noble suffering. She may respond with a cryptic letter, a token like a ribbon, or perhaps a single calculated nod from across the great hall. But mostly, she'll just be mysterious and unavailable, which is the entire point. The emotions are meant to be high, but the actual physical contact is minimal at best. You might get to hold her hand for a second during a formal dance, or your finger might brush against her gauntlet during a feast. Anything more, and suddenly it's not courtly love anymore. It's a scandal, or worse, adultery. And no one wants that, at least not officially. The entire system was designed to sublimate romantic and sexual energy into a socially acceptable, artistic form. This entire setup worked best when everyone involved agreed it was mostly pretend. It was a way for nobles to express longing, devotion, and creative angst, all without disrupting the very serious business of political marriages and land inheritance. It was a medieval venting mechanism, allowing knights to channel their passions and ladies to enjoy admiration without threatening the rigid social order. Was it dramatic? Absolutely. Did it involve more poetry than practicality? Constantly. But for a knight stuck between brutal battles and mind-numbing boredom, courtly love gave you something to write about and someone to fight for, even if only in metaphor. Just don't expect a happy ending, or a kiss, or even consistent eye contact. This was love as a literary genre, not a life plan. So, you've fallen for someone. Great. Now comes the hard part, expressing that affection in a society where touching someone's hand without a chaperone present is basically a declaration of war. Welcome to the medieval solution, tokens. Think of it as 12th century texting, slow, confusing, and open to wildly inaccurate interpretation. These small objects became the silent messengers of the heart. Let's say you're that knight, and you're hopelessly devoted to Lady Marjorie, of whatever her last name is. You can't speak to her alone, and your poems keep getting intercepted by her confessor. What do? You send her a glove, or maybe your embroidered sleeve. Nothing says "I adore you" from a respectable distance like mailing someone a part of your wardrobe. It was a tangible piece of yourself, a way of being present without physically being there. And if you're on the receiving end, congratulations. You now have a sweaty linen sleeve you didn't ask for, and the romantic burden of pretending you know what it means. Is he confessing his undying love, asking for a favor, suggesting you have a jousting tournament in his honor? Who knows? The ambiguity was the point. It allowed both parties to have plausible deniability if things went sour. Women gave tokens to a ribbon from her dress, a piece of her hair woven into a bracelet, or a tiny, embroidered pendant. It was sentimental, sure, but also deeply strategic. Giving the wrong guy the wrong token could suddenly mean you're considered spoken for by someone with a lazy eye and a serious drinking problem. These weren't just gifts. They were moves in a delicate social chess game. Tokens were meant to be displayed subtly. A glove from a lady might be pinned to a knight's chest during a tournament. A ribbon might be tied to his sword hilt. Everyone in the court knew what it signified, but no one said what it signified aloud. The more cryptic, the better. It was less about clear communication and more about creating a shared, secret understanding that floated just beneath the surface of public life. For commoners, tokens were simpler and more practical, but no less meaningful. Maybe you'd give someone a small wood carving you made. Maybe a handkerchief you stitched when you weren't milking something. It was still romantic, just with more calluses involved. A beautifully carved spoon could signal not just affection, but also skill and the ability to provide, a far more useful trait than writing bad poetry. These tokens were also risky. Giving one to the wrong person could spark rumors that could ruin a reputation. Receiving one you didn't want meant figuring out how to politely return someone's personal item without insulting their entire lineage. But for all the awkwardness, these small objects carried real emotional weight. They were the physical symbols of love in a world that didn't allow much room for its direct expression, a silent language in a very loud and restrictive world. So you finally build up the courage to talk to your crush. Maybe you offer them a flower you picked, or you try to quote a little bit of bad poetry you definitely didn't steal from a traveling minstrel. You're ready for a moment of intimacy, a genuine connection. Unfortunately, you're not alone. Welcome to the world of medieval dating surveillance, where love is never blind. It's heavily monitored by your mother, your priest, a nosy cousin, and sometimes all three at once. Let's say you're a young woman of marrying age. You are never just going for a walk. You're going for a walk with your cousin Margaret and her terrifyingly strict aunt, who is already judging your posture and the way you smile. Even if you're simply fetching water from the village well, someone is watching. Someone is always watching. It's less like dating and more like espionage, where your every move is noted and reported back to headquarters, which is usually your father. And if you're a man trying to court someone, you'd better hope you have the approval of her family, her parish priest, and the entire local gossip network. You show up at her house with a bouquet of wildflowers. Her father is probably standing just behind the door, sharpening something. Her mother is pretending to stir a pot that hasn't boiled in 3 hours, and the village priest just happens to be passing by on his way to morning prayers at sunset. The logic behind all this supervision was simple: protect virtue, preserve family honor, and absolutely prevent any unsanctioned touching, especially before marriage, especially alone, especially ever. Chaperones were there to be a physical barrier against temptation. Group outings were monitored. Walks were supervised. Sitting within a 6-foot radius of each other on a bench was only permissible if someone's grandmother was knitting nearby, pretending not to listen to every word. The church, of course, had opinions, lots of them. It regulated courtship the way a bouncer regulates a nightclub. Priests delivered fiery sermons about the sins of improper conduct and the mortal dangers of flirtation. Yes, that's right. Medieval clergy wrote lengthy treatises on why looking at someone for too long could lead your soul down a path to damnation. Imagine a monk copying those out by candlelight, silently judging your future romantic choices. This constant oversight created an atmosphere where privacy was a fantasy. Every interaction was public. Every word was potentially overheard. Even letter writing wasn't safe. There are accounts of some monasteries opening and reading love letters, screening them for any morally questionable content. That's right, divine censorship. Your heartfelt confession of love could be edited for heresy before it even reached its destination. So, if you wanted to fall in love, you had to get used to doing it quietly and in the presence of your entire extended family and possibly God himself. Romance wasn't a private affair between two people. It was a community-managed project, and any deviation from the plan was met with swift and severe social pressure. Love had to find a way to bloom in the cracks of a world that was determined to pave over them. So you're in love, or at least medieval in love, which is mostly longing, confusion, and a lot of pacing near windows. You've exchanged glances across a crowded feast. Maybe they picked up your dropped handkerchief and didn't immediately throw it into the fire. The tension is unbearable, but you still can't speak freely. There are chaperones, priests, and mothers lurking like emotional border patrol agents. So what do? You write a letter. Ah yes, the secret love letter. This was perhaps the most dangerous piece of parchment in the Middle Ages, second only to an excommunication notice. This was your one chance to confess your heart, but you had to do it using the most cryptic, overly poetic language possible. You couldn't just say, "I like you." You had to say something like, "My soul is a stag, pierced by the arrow of your grace, and it now roams the lonely forests of yearning." It had to be grand, metaphorical, and, most importantly, deniable. Actually, writing the letter was a challenge in itself. First, you had to be literate, which, let's be honest, wasn't a given for most of the population. Then you needed access to vellum or rough parchment, which was expensive. If you were really dedicated, you might dust the letter with flower petals or a faint touch of perfume. Just be careful with that one. A noble once accidentally used a love letter to wrap a herring and delivered it to the wrong girl. They're married now. It's fine. Now comes the biggest problem. Delivery. You couldn't just hand it over in the market square. You needed a trusted courier, a loyal servant, a bribed monk, or a younger sibling with a limited understanding of consequences and a desire for a shiny coin. Sometimes, even a traveling minstrel would do the job, singing your poem in the town square while pretending it was an anonymous composition he'd just thought of. It was subtle and incredibly risky. The poetry itself was a tightrope walk. The line between romantic and heretical was thinner than a serf's patience. During Lent, if your metaphor even hinted at anything physical or overly passionate, you might find yourself confessing to both lust and literary exaggeration before a church council. Your beautiful words had to be pure, noble, and focused on the spiritual beauty of the beloved, not their earthly form. But despite all the rules and the very real dangers, people did right. Some of these letters survived, tucked away in archives. Some poems were so good they were copied and passed around like forbidden fruit. In a world of rigid roles and constant supervision, a folded scrap of paper filled with carefully chosen words could feel revolutionary. It was a private world you created for just two people. So you write, you risk it all. You press your trembling hand to the parchment and say everything you can't say aloud, pouring your soul into ink. It's a desperate, beautiful act of rebellion against a world that demands your silence. Just remember the most important rule of all. Don't sign it too clearly. You're aiming for romance, not a church trial. Finally, a break, a feast day, a harvest festival, a maypole dance. In short, a rare moment when your life isn't just work, prayer, and pretending you're not interested in the blacksmith's daughter. Today, you're allowed to flirt. Sort of. As long as no one sees, or as long as everyone sees, but pretends not to notice. Welcome to medieval festivals, where romance was allowed to bloom under the watchful eyes of everyone you've ever met, and at least 3 chickens. Festivals were one of the few socially approved moments when unmarried men and women could mingle with a degree of freedom. There's music, there's ale, and there's someone wearing a flower crown with a dangerous amount of confidence. For a few hours, the rigid social structures would relax just enough to let a little bit of joy in. You've never seen so many people in one place, not pretending to be miserable about something. If you're a peasant, you might try to impress your crush by winning a wrestling match, catching a greased pig, or triumphing in a sack race. These weren't just silly games. They were public displays of strength, agility, and vitality. Nothing says I'm a good potential spouse like managing to fall off a hay bale with a shred of dignity intact. It was a chance to show off your physical fitness, which was a key indicator of your ability to work and survive. Dancing was your best shot at actual, sanctioned physical contact. The rules of the dance were rigid, dictating every step and turn. But a well-timed spin, or a not quite accidental hand graze could say more than any poem. The maypole dance, for example, was basically a giant, colorful excuse for coordinated flirtation, wrapped in bright ribbons and plausible deniability. For a few precious moments, you were allowed to hold hands with someone you weren't related to. If you're a noble, your version of flirting at a festival involved less hay and more poetry. You might be expected to compose a verse on the spot, comparing your chosen lady's eyes to twin candles or other appropriately glowing things. You could offer a trinket, hopefully one that wasn't clearly made by your servant 5 minutes earlier. It was a performance of wit and sophistication, designed to impress not just the lady, but everyone else watching. Food also played a crucial role in festival courtship. Offering your beloved a slice of a prized meat pie or sharing a honey cake was a significant gesture. If they accepted it with a smile, you were doing well. If they accepted it and then immediately handed it to their dog, it was probably time to start over with someone else. These small acts of sharing were a public signal of favor and interest. But remember, even in the midst of celebration, everything you do is being watched. A parent, a priest, a rival suitor, or a bard with a big mouth and a talent for gossip. One misstep, one smile, held for too long, and your flirty moment becomes a youthful indiscretion, discussed at church for the next 6 weeks. Still, for a few precious hours, you could pretend. You could pretend you lived in a world where love wasn't a transaction, where laughter wasn't suspicious, and where dancing in public didn't end in penance. Let's say you're not a knight, a noble, or a bard with a lute and an excess of feelings. You're a regular villager. You wake up with the cows, you go to bed with the chickens, and you spend most of your day ankle deep in something you'd rather not think about. You're not looking for a poetic soulmate. You're looking for someone who can milk a goat without having an emotional drama about it. Welcome to peasant courtship, where romance is practical, gestures are modest, and chemistry means you can probably survive a winter together. In your world, dating is less about long, soul-searching conversations and more about shared tasks. You notice someone you like because they work hard, they don't complain much, and they have a decent set of teeth. That's it. That's the whole checklist. You're not being picky. You're being realistic. You don't need fireworks and sonnets. You need someone who can help gut a fish and maybe doesn't snore loud enough to scare the livestock. So, how do you show your interest? You give gifts, but they are small, useful things. A basket of your best eggs, a bundle of firewood you gathered, a particularly good turnip from your garden. And if you're feeling especially bold, maybe a woven ribbon or a small, carved wooden spoon. Nothing says I'm serious about you like a spoon you whittled by candlelight, while your family's pig judged you silently from the corner of the hut. Conversations, when they happen, occur during shared chores. You might walk together on the path to the mill, chat while mending a fence, or exchange a few pleasantries while shoveling something that smells questionable. No one is reciting poetry. You're talking about the weather, the state of the crop yields, and whether or not old Thomas fell in the well again. This shared reality was the foundation of any potential relationship. And yet, in its own quiet way, it's romantic. There's a sweetness in the simplicity of it all. It's a shared life being built not on abstract idealism, but on tangible cooperation. You come to know each other's strengths, weaknesses, and how fast they can run when a goat escapes its pen. You see each other at your worst, covered in mud, exhausted from a long day's labor, and that builds a different kind of intimacy, one based on mutual respect and endurance. Proposals, when they came, were often quick and to the point. If you both seemed to agree, and more importantly, the families agreed, marriage would follow swiftly. There was no long engagement period. Maybe you moved into a shared hut, or maybe you built a new one from scratch with help from the rest of the village. You brought your best blanket, they brought their most productive goat, and together you began the strange and difficult miracle of domestic survival. It's not glamorous. There are no soaring poems written about a shared ability to plow a field in straight lines, but it's honest. This was a partnership forged in the realities of a harsh world. You found someone who could cook, clean, tolerate your family, and didn't visibly recoil at the sight of your feet. In medieval peasant life, that was about as close to true love as you could get. You've done it. You've found someone who can cook, clean, tolerate your family, and doesn't visibly recoil at the sight of your feet. True love, right? Now it's time to get married, which, in medieval terms, means you're not so much entering a dreamy union under the stars as you are signing a legally binding contract, often negotiated with all the passion and romance of a livestock auction. If you're a peasant, the ceremony itself is still a big deal. You gather a few witnesses from the village, you talk to the local priest, and you try not to trip over the Latin phrases during the service. But behind the sweet-sounding blessings is a serious checklist. Dowry, land rights, who gets the good cow, and what happens to the property if one of you dies unexpectedly during planting season. Ah yes, romance. If you're from the upper class, buckle up. Your marriage is a full-blown legal negotiation that has likely been going on for months, if not years. Your parents, their parents, the priest, a scribe, and maybe a cousin who once studied law in Bologna. They're all in on it. The bride and groom are mostly just there for decoration, standing nearby looking ornamental and nodding whenever they're spoken to. You may or may not have even met the person you're about to be bound to for life. Your family has already done the math. Your large estate needs her fertile fields to expand. Her hefty dowry will balance your family's debts. And, most importantly, both of your coats of arms look particularly good next to each other on a tapestry. Love is an optional extra. The merger is not. And once you're married, it is permanent. Divorce, in the modern sense of the word, isn't really a thing. The church viewed marriage as an unbreakable, sacred bond. You could try for an annulment, but that required a lot of paperwork, a bit of luck, and a solid bribe. You'd need to prove that someone wasn't baptized, was secretly your third cousin, or that the marriage was never consummated, a claim that often required sworn testimony from witnesses. Still, not everything was quite so bleak. Some couples, thrust together by family ambition and economic necessity, genuinely grew to love each other over time. The shared experiences of running a household, raising children, and surviving harsh winters have a way of building a powerful bond of affection, or at least a deep-seated tolerance, which, in medieval terms, was often basically the same thing. The church was deeply involved in every single step. Marriage was a holy sacrament, one of the 7 big ones. You didn't just marry for legal reasons. You married because God Himself needed to be a witness, possibly to divine contract sealed in heaven, which made breaking it not just a social crime, but a sin. So you stand there, exchange your vows, and smile politely as someone hands over a sack of onions and calls it a blessing. Welcome to married life. So, let's say you've had enough. Enough contracts, enough negotiations, enough being treated like a particularly valuable sack of flour. You're a noble, but for once, you want to marry for love. Not for land, not for lineage, not for your father's strategic ambitions. Just love. Congratulations, you're about to cause a massive scandal. A noble elopement was the medieval equivalent of lighting your family tree on fire and dancing in the ashes. If you ran off to marry someone of your own choosing, it wasn't just an act of personal rebellion. It was political and economic sabotage. Alliances would be broken, treaties would be voided, and carefully planned dynastic mergers would collapse. Your personal happiness would come at the cost of your family's power and prestige, and they would not be pleased. Let's say your Lady Eleonora promised to some boring but incredibly wealthy von Statziger, but you've fallen madly in love with a penniless squire who smells faintly of horses and adventure. You meet in secret, whispering sweet nothings in the stables, and one day you simply vanish. You ride off to a remote monastery where the abbot owes your family a favor, or perhaps is susceptible to a large, anonymous donation to the church roof fund. There, you get married under questionable legality, with only a nervous young monk and 2 chickens as your official witnesses. It's a rushed, secret ceremony, filled with more fear than fanfare, but for a moment, it feels like a victory. You've chosen your own path, you've followed your heart. You are, for the first time in your life, in control of your own destiny. Back at home, however, it is pure chaos. Your family is outraged. Your father is threatening to lay siege to the groom's family garden. Your mother is crying into her finest embroidery hoop. The church is deeply concerned about the validity of the union, and the gossip spreading through the court is absolutely delicious. You have become the main character in a story that will be whispered at banquets for years to come. And if you're the groom in this romantic rebellion, don't get too comfortable. Best case scenario, you get to keep your bride and your kneecaps. Worst case scenario, you're excommunicated. Your lands are forfeited, and you might face a rather unpleasant and public end. Marrying a highborn lady without her family's consent was seen as a form of theft, and the punishment could be severe. Still, some couples got away with it. If the union couldn't be undone without causing even more embarrassment, families would sometimes just sigh, accept the situation, and move on. After all, what's done is done, and at least nobody died, hopefully. In rare cases, these scandals became legends. Songs were written, poems were composed, and the stories of two nobles who chose love over duty became practically mythological. These brief, passionate escapes reminded the world that love, though deeply inconvenient, refused to go extinct. Ah, marriage, that beautiful union of two souls and their respective financial portfolios. Because in the Middle Ages, love was nice, but a dowry, now that was truly romantic. Let's be clear. When you got married, you weren't just gaining a spouse. You were participating in a significant economic exchange that had been planned for years. Let's say you're a bride. You're not just getting married. You're being launched like a small, dowry-equipped economic vessel. Your family prepares your dowry, which could include money, livestock, plots of land, fine linens, and maybe even a set of pewter dishes if they're feeling particularly generous. These offerings go to your future husband and his family, who accept you and your portable wealth with open arms and a mental calculator. This dowry was not a personal gift for you to control. It became part of the new household's economy, managed entirely by your husband. It was guarded by law and custom, and hopefully not gambled away on dice and ale within the first month of marriage. The size of your dowry was a direct reflection of your family's status and a public statement about the value they placed on the union. Now, flip the scenario. In some cultures and regions, it wasn't the bride's family giving the goods, it was the bride price. In this system, the groom's family pays her family for the honor of marrying her. It was effectively a way of saying, here's a horse, a cloak, and 3 pigs. Thank you for your daughter. This was a direct compensation to the bride's family for the loss of her labor and her presence in their household. Whether it was a dowry or a bride price, the point is that someone was paying someone. You were getting married, and there was absolutely a receipt involved. These exchanges weren't just about wealth. They were about setting expectations and cementing social bonds. A large dowry might indicate that a bride came from a prestigious family. A stingy one might suggest they were trying to offload her quickly, possibly due to suspicious personality traits or a known habit of talking back. If the marriage ended through death, annulment, or your husband spontaneously wandering off to join a monastery after a midlife crisis, your dowry could theoretically be returned to you or your family. However, actually retrieving it was often harder than pulling a sword from a stone. You'd need significant social support, legal backing, and ideally, a male relative who could argue your case effectively. The bride price, on the other hand, was like buying a rare goat, expensive up front and absolutely no refunds. It compensated the bride's family for their loss, and that was the end of the transaction. So, while love was occasionally in the mix, and poems were sometimes written, money was always at the altar. It was the silent, non-negotiable guest at every wedding, the foundation upon which the sacred union was built. So you didn't go the marriage route. Maybe you were the second son with no land to inherit, or your dowry was suspiciously small, or maybe you just really liked chanting. Either way, you've joined a monastery or a convent. Congratulations, you've now taken a solemn vow of poverty, chastity, and an aggressive disinterest in all worldly romance. And yet, here you are, in a silent stone cloister, surrounded by candle smoke, and you can't stop thinking about Brother Anselm's unexpectedly soulful eyes. Yes, even behind the high walls of a monastery, forbidden love found a way to bloom. To be absolutely clear, falling in love within a religious order was deeply, profoundly discouraged. This wasn't just breaking a rule. It was breaking a sacred vow to God. The punishments could be severe: public penance, dietary restrictions, solitary confinement, or even being exiled to a different, less desirable abbey, known mostly for its dampness and surly sheep. You've sworn to give your heart entirely to God, which means giving it to literally no one else. But hearts have always been unruly things, and sometimes evening prayers start sounding a lot like love poems. Perhaps it begins with innocent, shared tasks, passing each other bread in the silent refectory, whispering together during Vespers when you're supposed to be contemplating sin, laughing a little too hard when someone drops a heavy hymnal during Mass. Before you know it, you're tucking an extra piece of cheese into Sister Beatrix's satchel for her journey. Or you're finding excuses to work alongside Brother Thomas in the herb garden. These small, quiet gestures become a secret language. A shared glance across the chapel during a sermon could hold more meaning and elicit thrill than any public courtship in the outside world. Some monks and nuns wrote passionate letters to one another, cleverly disguised as theological musings. A phrase like, "Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation," sounds perfectly holy, unless you know to read between the lines, and many did. These letters were dangerous artifacts, proof of a love that was supposed to be impossible. Inevitably, there were scandals, secret meetings in the scriptorium after dark, midnight confessions that weren't strictly sacramental, and the occasional gasp-worthy discovery of a nun with a suspiciously round belly. The outrage from the abbot or abbess would be swift and terrible. The lovers would be separated, punished, and reminded of their sacred duties. Still, not all of these stories ended in disgrace. A few lovers managed to escape the cloister walls together, choosing a life of exile over a life of piety without passion. Most, though, simply returned to their duties, red-faced and redevoted, swearing that the whole affair was just an overzealous theological debate. Because in the end, monastic life was about discipline. But humans are humans, even in robes, even in silence. You did it. You got married. There was a priest, probably a pig roast, and someone definitely spilled mead on your mother's only nice cloak. But now it's been a few months, or maybe a few years, and something feels off. Maybe your spouse snores like a dying lute. Maybe they forgot to mention their chronic gambling problem. Or maybe you've just come to the stark realization that marrying for land and sheep doesn't automatically result in romantic bliss. Either way, welcome to the world of medieval marital disappointment. Now, don't go reaching for the divorce papers, because they don't exist, at least not in any form you'd recognize. Marriage was a sacred and practically unbreakable bond, approved by the Church, sealed by God, and enforced by public shame. The idea that you could simply end a marriage because you don't get along would have been met with blank stares, and probably a lecture from your local priest. You could try for an annulment, but you'd need a very, very good reason. An annulment didn't mean you were ending a marriage. It meant you were proving the marriage was never valid to begin with. You'd have to prove that one of you was underage at the time, already secretly married to someone else, too closely related, which happened disturbingly often among the nobility, or, the best-case scenario, that the marriage was never consummated. This often required humiliating public testimony and was incredibly difficult to prove. If you're a noble, it gets even messier. Your marriage wasn't just a personal commitment. It was a political alliance. Trying to escape it could start a bitter feud between two powerful families, ignite a public scandal that would tarnish your name forever, or, in some cases, even launch a minor war. It was often far easier and safer to just quietly resent each other from opposite ends of the castle and attend separate feasts. So what did unhappy couples do? Mostly, they just endured it. You sleep in different beds, or at least on opposite sides of the same lumpy mattress. You sigh dramatically at the dinner table. You pour all of your frustrated feelings into your embroidery, or into that one really angry-sounding song. Passive aggression becomes your primary love language, a silent, bitter war waged over burnt stew and muddy boots. Of course, affairs happened. They usually happened quietly, but sometimes they happened spectacularly. Nobles had their secret lovers and clandestine meetings in the garden. Peasants had their suspiciously helpful neighbors. The church condemned adultery with fire and brimstone, of course, but that didn't stop people. It just made them much, much better at sneaking around barns and blaming things on God's mysterious will. For women, getting out of a bad or abusive marriage was especially difficult. Even if your husband was violent, a drunkard, or simply vanished one day, society and the church expected you to remain loyal, silent, and piously devoted to his memory, all while surviving off bread crusts and community disapproval. Still, some people made it work. Marriages weren't always happy, but they could become functional partnerships forged by shared hardship, ingrained habit, and the mutual experience of hauling firewood in the pouring rain. Let's say your spouse dies. Maybe it was the plague. Maybe it was a farming accident. Or maybe they just tripped over a goose in the dark. It happened. In a world with limited medicine and constant hardship, death was an ever-present part of married life. And just like that, you are now widowed, and suddenly, the medieval dating pool opens back up for you, whether you want it to or not. Being a widow in the Middle Ages was an oddly liberating position, especially for women. Not do whatever you want liberating, but it certainly offered more freedom and power than you ever had as an unmarried girl or a wife. For the first time, a woman might find herself managing land, making business decisions. She was the head of her own household, a position of rare autonomy. And if you were a widow who was still youngish and had all her teeth, you could expect to remarry, and quickly, very quickly. While mourning periods certainly existed, so did practical survival instincts. A widow with land, a house, and no husband was basically a walking treasure chest. Suitors would appear with alarming speed, some of them sincere, others just very enthusiastic about your late husband's dairy cows. If you're a man and recently widowed, society practically shoves you back into the marriage market. Who else is going to cook the meals, mend the clothes, and raise the 11 children you somehow accumulated? A household couldn't function without a woman's labor. So you start looking, maybe at the baker's daughter, or maybe at that quiet widow from the next village who always brings suspiciously good mead to the market. Romance in second marriages could be surprisingly sweet. This time around, you're older, you're wiser, and you're not a naive teenager being pushed into a strategic alliance by your parents. You're choosing someone to survive with, and maybe, just maybe, you're choosing someone you actually like. It was a wild concept, but it happened. These unions were often built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared experience. Of course, there were still rules. The church generally permitted remarriage, but it frowned upon unions that happened too quickly. You were expected to wait a respectable amount of time, though respectable could be shortened considerably if there was a harvest to bring in. And widows often had to engage in tough negotiations with their deceased husband's family over dowries, inheritance, and who got to keep the good butter churn. But still, second marriages were common, even expected. Life was short, and winters were long. No one wanted to spend them alone if they didn't have to. And yes, love was a part of it. Maybe not the swooning, sonnetriting kind of love from your youth, but a quieter, more durable kind. It was a love based on shared stories, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding that both of you had already seen some things. So you light the fire, you pour the soup, and you try again. You've made it this far. You've survived the contracts, the courtships, the chaperones, and possibly even a dramatic elopement in a barn. But before you fall for someone new, or commit to the person your family has chosen, you must ask yourself the most medieval question of all. Are you cosmically allowed to love this person? Because in the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of the heart. It was a matter of the stars, the saints, a few bones, and whether or not your grandmother saw a fox cross the path that morning. Let's begin with astrology. Yes, before you even thought about holding hands, you might want to consult the local monk or village-wise woman who dabbled in reading the heavens. Are your signs compatible? Was your beloved born under an unlucky moon? Is Venus in retrograde, suggesting a period of romantic turmoil? If the celestial forecast was gloomy, you might be advised to marry someone less cosmically cursed. Love is hard enough without planetary sabotage. Then there were the endless superstitions and omens that governed daily life. Everything was a sign. If a raven flew overhead while you were thinking about someone, that was a very bad sign. If you dropped your bread at dinner while glancing at your crush, forget it. That union is clearly cursed. Someone might bury a protective charm under your doorstep to ward off improper suitors. Or, conversely, a rival might bury one to sabotage your chances. It worked both ways. The church had its own complex checklist of cosmic and spiritual prohibitions. You couldn't marry your cousin, or your second cousin, or your fourth cousin twice removed, because you were bound by the intricate laws of consanguinity. The church taught that these bonds of blood were sacred, and to cross them was to invite divine displeasure, unless, of course, you were wealthy and powerful enough to buy a special permission, a dispensation that proved God was flexible for the right price. Social status also mattered on a deeply spiritual level. The rigid hierarchy of medieval society, from king down to serf, was believed to be divinely ordained. A noble could not fall in love with a peasant without it being declared either a miracle or a serious moral failing. Cross-class romance was rare, scandalous, and seen as a violation of the natural order of things. It was only acceptable if it later became a tragic folk song sung for entertainment. And then there were the birthmarks, dreams, and prophecies. A mysterious mole on your hand might be interpreted as a sign of a great destiny, or a mark of a witch. A dream about a pig could mean wealth was coming, or that your intended spouse had bad manners. It was all open to interpretation, and everyone, from the village priest to the old woman in the woods, who definitely wasn't a witch, except she probably was, had an opinion. Love in this world wasn't just personal, it was mystical. Your choice of partner had to be approved, not just by your family, but by the saints, the stars, the weather, and the general mood of the universe that week. But despite all the rules, all the signs, and all the whispered warnings, people still fell in love. Clumsily, bravely, and often against all advice. Because medieval or not, the human heart has always remained wonderfully, beautifully disobedient. This part is approximately 590 words. This concludes the primary topic of dating in medieval times. As per the reference script, the topic now shifts to a new story about Queen Tomyris. The reference script's length is 15,541 words. We have completed approximately 8,100 words so far. To match the requested length, I will now transition to this new topic, maintaining the same tone and style for the remaining parts. You've probably heard of Alexander the Great, and maybe even Julius Caesar, but have you ever heard of the woman who allegedly chopped off the head of Cyrus the Great and dunked it in a wineskin filled with blood? Her name was Tomyris, and she didn't rule from a throne gilded in gold or from within high-walled cities. No, her court was the open sky, her army was the wind, and her power came not from titles, but from pure, unshakable authority. She was the queen of the Massagetæ, a confederation of nomadic tribes who roamed the vast, unforgiving steppes of Central Asia. Think horse archers, tattooed warriors, ritual feasts under the stars, and a justice system delivered swiftly from the back of a horse. This was a world away from the marble courts of Greece or the sprawling palaces of Persia. Tomyris didn't inherit her power through a pampered, courtier-led system. She rose through grit, leadership, and probably a healthy dose of "don't mess with me" energy. Her people were tough, accustomed to harsh winters, long migrations, and enemies on every side. But even among such a formidable people, she stood out. She was a warrior, a lawgiver, and a ruler in her own right. No husband overshadowed her. No brother guided her hand. Now, to be clear, much of what we know about Tomyris comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, a man not exactly known for his strict fact-checking. He loved a good story, and the tale of a barbarian queen defeating a Persian king was too good not to tell. But if even a fraction of his account is true, then Tomyris wasn't just a queen. She was a storm in human form, a force of nature who would bend to no man. At the heart of her story is this: a foreign superpower was growing stronger by the day. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, led by the legendary Cyrus the Great, was swallowing the known world. He had already conquered the mighty kingdoms of Lydia and Babylon, and now his gaze turned east, towards the endless grasslands. The Massagetæ were next on his list. But Cyrus, for all his brilliance as a conqueror, didn't fully understand what kind of woman he was about to face. Before the first arrow flew, before the first spear shattered, and long before the death of her son would change everything, Tomyris was already preparing for war. Not because she wanted conquest, but because she refused to accept submission. She wasn't just defending a patch of territory on a map. She was defending a way of life, a culture of freedom that had existed for centuries on the steppe. And as Cyrus the Great, the King of Kings, would soon learn, there are some queens you just don't invade. Cyrus the Great had a reputation. He wasn't just any king, he was a conqueror's conqueror, the kind of man who could stroll into ancient cities, topple entire empires, and still get remembered fondly by most historians. So when he looked east toward the vast open lands of the Massagetæ, he didn't exactly expect to be met with serious resistance. After all, who could possibly say no to the man who had taken Babylon without even breaking a sweat. He sent a polite offer first, because, of course, every good imperialist starts with a smile. He proposed a political marriage between himself and Queen Tomyris. Now, you might think that sounds romantic, but Tomyris saw right through it. She was a shrewd leader who understood the language of power. This wasn't about love or even a genuine alliance. It was about control. If she married Cyrus, her kingdom would become just another province of the Persian Empire, and she would be reduced to a trophy queen. She declined firmly. She understood that accepting the proposal meant surrendering her people's independence, and that was a price she was not willing to pay. Cyrus, unaccustomed to being told no, did not take the rejection well. If he couldn't charm her into submission, he would simply take her kingdom by force. He marched his massive army to the Araxes River, which marked the border between his empire and the lands of the Massagetæ, and began to build a bridge to cross it. This is when the conflict took a darker, more personal turn. Cyrus, perhaps on the advice of his generals, decided to lay a trap. He left a small portion of his army behind in a lavishly prepared camp. The camp was deliberately overflowing with fine foods and, most importantly, huge quantities of strong, undiluted wine, a luxury that the nomadic Massagetæ rarely indulged in and were not accustomed to drinking. Tomyris's son, Spargapises, was leading a third of the Massagetæ army. He and his men discovered the seemingly abandoned Persian camp. Seeing the weak guard and the tempting supplies, they raided it. They feasted, they celebrated their easy victory, and, fatally, they drank the wine. They drank until they were disoriented, drunk, and completely unprepared for what came next. The main Persian force, which had been hiding nearby, returned at just the right moment. They fell upon the intoxicated and incapacitated Massagetæ warriors. Spargapises and his men were overwhelmed and captured with barely a fight. Spargapises, the son of the queen, was taken alive. When Tomyris heard the news that her son had been captured, not in a fair fight, but through trickery, her world cracked. This was no longer just a military loss. It was a deeply personal insult. She sent a messenger to Cyrus with a chilling ultimatum. "Give me back my son and leave my lands unharmed," she declared. "If you do not, I swear by the sun, the great master of the Massagetæ, that I will give you your fill of blood, though you are insatiable." Cyrus didn't listen. Grief is a powerful thing, but grief mixed with cold, calculated fury, that's the recipe for absolute devastation. When Queen Tomyris learned that her son, Spargapises, had taken his own life in Persian captivity out of shame, something inside her snapped. This was no longer about borders, or pride, or even national independence. This was now a war soaked in vengeance, and Tomyris was not the kind of woman to grieve quietly. She didn't retire to her tent in mourning robes or weep by the fire. No, according to the legend, she mounted her horse, sharpened her weapons, and swore an oath that would echo through history. She would face Cyrus in open battle. She would defeat his invincible army. And then she would make sure that the great king never forgot her name, not even in death. Following her son's death, Tomyris summoned her tribal councils and gathered all her forces. Under her direct command, the entire Massagetæ nation mobilized for war. Picture it, thousands of warriors on horseback, their faces painted for battle, adorned in hardened leather armor, and wielding deadly composite bows and spears. They didn't march in neat, orderly lines like a Persian army. They moved like a gathering storm across the steppe, swift, chaotic, and with a deadly, unified purpose. This time, she would set the terms of the engagement. Cyrus, perhaps overconfident from his earlier deception and underestimating the resolve of a grieving mother, advanced to meet her. But Tomyris knew his tactics now. She had studied his movements, anticipated his arrogance, and waited for the perfect moment to unleash the full fury of her people. The two armies finally clashed in what the historian Herodotus describes as one of the fiercest and bloodiest battles of the ancient world. There were no fancy formations or long, eloquent speeches here. There was just the thunder of hooves, the screaming of horses, the clash of blades against shields, and a queen who fought alongside her warriors in the heart of the chaos. Tomyris was no silk-probed empress watching from a distant hill. She was in the thick of it, riding hard, her blade cutting down enemies with a merciless focus, her presence inspiring her warriors to fight with a ferocity the Persians had never before encountered. And when the dust finally began to settle, the unthinkable had happened. Cyrus the Great, the conqueror of Babylon, the king of kings, was dead. Tomyris, ever theatrical in her justice, had his body searched for and brought before her. In the story's gruesome and unforgettable climax, she had his head severed from his body. She then took a wineskin, filled it to the brim with human blood, and plunged the head of Cyrus into it. According to Herodotus, she spoke to the lifeless head, saying, "You thirsted for blood. Now, drink your fill." Whether this detail is literally true is debated by historians, but its power is undeniable. Tomyris had won. She had crushed the most powerful empire of her day, avenged her son, and cemented her name in legend, not as a victim, but as a conqueror. The battlefield was silent now, save for the wind whistling across the plains. The Persians were dead or fleeing, their legendary king lifeless in the dust. And Tomyris, the queen of the Massagetæ, didn't celebrate like a conqueror. She didn't parade through the streets of Persepolis or carve her face into stone monuments. Instead, she stood over the body of Cyrus, her vengeance fulfilled, but her heart likely still broken. Victory, it turned out, didn't bring peace. The Massagetæ had won more than just a battle. They had turned back the tide of an empire. The death of Cyrus the Great sent shockwaves across the ancient world. In Babylon, in Egypt, and in the far corners of the Persian realm, rumors swirled. The unstoppable king, the great unifier, had fallen, and he had not fallen at the hands of another great empire, but to a nomadic queen who had no throne, no palace, just cold fury, unbreakable grit, and a cavalry of warriors who would ride into hell for her. And yet, Tomyris didn't exploit her victory for personal gain or conquest. She returned to her people with the same fierce pragmatism with which she had always ruled. There were no war taxes levied, no imperial ambitions declared. She didn't try to seize the Persian throne for herself. That wasn't her world. Her justice had been served, her son had been avenged, and the Persian Empire could continue on without Cyrus. But now, it would think twice before ever riding east again. It's worth noting just how rare this kind of leadership was. Most rulers, after winning a decisive battle of that magnitude, would have grabbed for more power with both hands. But Tomyris seemed far more concerned with preserving her people's freedom and way of life than with expanding her own reach. Her war was defensive, born of necessity and grief, not ambition. And this is where her story begins to fade from the historical record. There are no accounts of her life after the battle. No royal tomb has ever been found, no Massagetæ monuments carved in stone to commemorate her victory. She rides into the fog of history, as elusive and untamed as the steppes themselves. Historians still debate whether Herodotus exaggerated his tale. Some ancient sources claim Cyrus died elsewhere, that the dramatic wineskin of blood was just a bit of poetic fiction to make a good story even better. But even the skeptics agree on one thing: someone dealt the mighty Persian Empire a heavy and humiliating blow in the East. And it wasn't a king, it wasn't a general, it was a queen. Her story, true or not in all its details, didn't need to be written in stone. It was carried on the wind. Because when the wind howls across the great Eurasian steppe, some still say it whispers her name, Tomyris. To truly understand Tomyris, you have to understand the people she led. The Massagetæ weren't your typical ancient civilization. They built no marble temples, no hanging gardens, no libraries filled with scrolls of poetry. They were a nomadic warrior culture, living in the vast, untamed lands east of the Caspian Sea. Lands that were too wild for Persian governors or Babylonian scribes. Their world was one of constant movement, pragmatic survival, and fierce honor. Imagine sprawling, grassy plains without any borders. Your wealth is counted not in gold coins, but in herds of horses and cattle. Your home is a portable yurt, designed to be taken down and packed away at a moment's notice. In this world, children were taught to ride almost before they could walk straight. Archery wasn't a sport you practiced on weekends. It was an essential skill, second only to breathing. Their weapons were practical and deadly. Short composite bows perfect for shooting from horseback at a full gallop, curved swords for close combat, and iron-tipped spears. They hunted, they raided, and they fought with incredible ferocity to protect their freedom. Their entire way of life was built around mobility and the horse. And unlike in many of the patriarchal settled societies of the time, Massagetæ women could and did fight. This wasn't an exception to the rule. It was an expected part of their culture. Warrior women weren't just the stuff of legends. They were your neighbors, your sisters, your queen. So when Tomyris picked up a sword and led her people into battle, no one would have raised an eyebrow. She wasn't pretending to be a man or defying social norms. She was being the leader her people expected. Their society valued strength, but it also valued justice. Crimes were often punished harshly, but leadership was based on consensus, not absolute tyranny. Kings and queens had to prove themselves through their deeds, their wisdom, and their courage, not just through their bloodline. Loyalty had to be earned. As for their religion, they were, according to Herodotus, sun worshippers. Remember Tomyris's famous warning to Cyrus. She swore her oath of vengeance by the sun, the master of the Massagetæ. To them, the sun was life, light, and the ultimate judge of all oaths. To break your word was to spit in the face of the heavens, an unforgivable offense. In short, Tomyris wasn't some strange anomaly. She was the ideal embodiment of her people, fierce, principled, and deeply proud. She didn't rise to power in spite of being a woman. She rose to power because she was exactly the kind of strong, decisive leader the Massagetæ revered. While the Persians had bureaucracy and monumental architecture, the Massagetæ had freedom. And in one brutal, history-defining clash, that freedom held its ground. You know what's strange? Almost everything we know about Tomyris, her epic battle with Cyrus, the tragic death of her son, the gruesome wineskin full of blood, it all comes down to us from a single man, Herodotus. Now, Herodotus is often called the father of history, which sounds very grand and official, until you realize he could also be called the father of hearsay, myth, and dramatic flair. The man loved a good story, and if that story happened to involve divine omens, gory revenge, or powerful queens shoving heads into bags of blood, well, even better. So, how much of the tale of Tomyris is actually true? That really depends on how much you trust a Greek historian, writing decades after the events, who had almost certainly never met a single member of the Massagetæ tribe in his entire life. Herodotus relied on second-hand accounts, travelers' tales, and whatever rumors were circulating throughout the Persian Empire. To him, history wasn't just a dry record of facts. It was a performance, a moral lesson, and entertainment all rolled into one. Still, here's the thing. He chose to tell her story in a world that was absolutely brimming with tales of male warlords, tyrants, and kings. Herodotus went out of his way to spotlight a nomadic steppe queen who brought down one of the greatest and most respected rulers in history. That decision, in itself, is not nothing. He saw her story as important enough to include in his great work. And it's easy to see why the tale spread so widely and endured for so long. It simply had everything a good story needs: a noble, powerful woman, a tragic loss, a cunning and arrogant enemy, a battle to the death, and a shocking, gory finale worthy of any Greek tragedy. If you were living in Athens or Thebes and heard this tale from a traveling bard, you would remember the name Tomyris forever. Over time, her story morphed and was reinterpreted through the lens of different cultures. Medieval chronicles painted her as a kind of savage Amazonian warrior. Renaissance artists absolutely adored her, depicting her drenched in blood, calmly holding the severed head of Cyrus like a trophy. She was exotic, fearsome, and iconic all at once. Yet, through all of these retellings, something that feels real still clings to her legend. Maybe not the exact dialogue, and maybe not the wineskin, but the bones of the story, the queen, the sun, the war, the victory, feel too specific, too raw, and too human to be pure invention. In the end, Herodotus didn't just preserve the memory of Tomyris, he mythologized her. And while that may blur the lines between historical fact and dramatic fiction, it also ensured that her name would live on far longer than any of Cyrus's imperial edicts. Because history might forget generals, but it always remembers vengeance. For a queen with no surviving monuments of her own, Tomyris has haunted the imagination of empires for over 2,000 years. Her story, once written down by Herodotus, took on a life of its own, especially in Europe. Renaissance painters, in particular, absolutely adored her. She was a dramatic muse, perfect for the bloody, moralizing climax of a grand canvas. In 1622, the master painter Peter Paul Rubens depicted her calmly holding a golden platter, while Cyrus's severed head is ceremonially dunked into a vessel brimming with blood. In other paintings, she stands regal and composed, a figure of icy justice, while courtiers look on in a mixture of horror and awe. For these artists, the appeal was in the contrast. The civilized, noble queen presiding over a savage, brutal act. To European artists and thinkers, Tomyris wasn't just a historical figure. She was symbolism incarnate. She was a woman who punished pride. She was a noble savage. She was a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition. Depending on who was holding the brush or the pen, She could represent the righteous fury of a mother, the perceived barbarism of the East, or the wisdom of a ruler who refused to be bought. Writers loved her, too. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, she appeared in plays, novels, and philosophical essays. Enlightenment thinkers debated her legacy. Was she proof that women could govern as wisely and ruthlessly as men? Or was she a terrifying reminder of what happens when raw emotion is allowed to rule over reason? Either way, she stayed in print. Oddly enough, while her memory was preserved by outsiders, her own people, the Massagetæ, faded from history, likely absorbed or erased by later nomadic cultures. No carved inscriptions, no burial mounds with gold plaques saying Tomyris was here. Her memory survived entirely through the eyes of those who saw her as a fearsome, exotic other. But in more recent times, her story has been reclaimed. In Soviet era and modern Central Asia, Tomyris was reborn as a symbol of national resistance against foreign imperialism. Statues of her have been erected in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Modern scholars have re-evaluated her, not as a bloodthirsty barbarian, but as a legitimate head of state, a woman who ruled, led armies, and negotiated from a position of undeniable strength. And her story continues to echo. She has appeared in everything from television documentaries to strategy, video games, where she is often a playable leader. One moment, she's being analyzed in an academic journal on gender and power. The next, she's leading a cavalry charge on a computer screen. That's some serious range. And it all goes back to one story, told by one Greek historian 2,500 years ago. Tomyris wasn't the first woman to lead warriors into battle, and she certainly wasn't the last. But history, especially ancient history, written by men, has a tendency to treat women like her as strange exceptions, isolated flashes of lightning in a world otherwise ruled by men. The truth, however, is that Tomyris was part of a long and often overlooked lineage of women who ruled, not from a protected throne, but through the power of the sword. Let's rewind a bit. Before Tomyris, there was Shamaramit, the powerful Assyrian queen, who likely inspired the later Greek myths of Semiramis, the legendary builder of cities and slayer of rebels. Around the same era, the Scythians, who were cultural cousins of the Massagetæ, had female warriors who were buried with their weapons, their skeletons showing clear signs of battle injuries. These weren't ceremonial roles. These women fought, they bled, and they died on horseback. And after Tomyris came more, Boudica, the Celtic queen of the Iceni tribe, who led a fiery and devastating revolt against the Roman Empire in the 1st century CE, is often compared to her. Just like Tomyris, Boudica's war was sparked by a deeply personal loss. Her daughters were assaulted, and her lands were seized by the Romans. Her response: she burned Roman settlements to the ground. The parallels are uncanny. Grief turning to vengeance, and an arrogant empire that was too proud to see what was coming. Then there was Zenobia, the queen of Palmyra, who in the 3rd century CE defied Rome itself and carved out her own mini-empire in the east. She minted her own coins with her face on them. She declared independence, and she forced the Roman emperor himself to come to her. She was a scholar, a politician, and a formidable military leader, all in one. What binds all of these women together, Tomyris included, isn't just their power, it's their audacity. They led armies in eras that pretended leadership belonged exclusively to men. They wielded authority not as gentle caretakers or as temporary stand-ins for their husbands, but as legitimate strategists, generals, and rulers in their own right. And while many male leaders were praised for their conquests and their ruthlessness, these women were often labeled as dangerous, unnatural, or savage by the historians of their enemies. Why? Perhaps because they won. Or perhaps because their very existence challenged the comfortable, male-dominated order of the world. Tomyris wasn't an outlier. She was part of a global, centuries-long pattern of women who rose to power in times of crisis and made kings bleed. Her story reminds us that female leadership wasn't rare, it was just rarely recorded. So when you picture ancient warfare, don't just see helmets and beards. See a queen on horseback, bow in hand, with fire in her eyes, and understand that she was not alone. Tomyris never built a palace. She didn't leave behind golden inscriptions or dynastic walls. There is no great tomb for tourists to visit, no preserved armor in a museum, and no marble bust to tell us what she looked like, and yet she endures. In many ways, her legacy is a paradox. Her entire story, the foundation of her 2,000-year-old fame, hinges on just a handful of paragraphs from Herodotus. Paragraphs that are biased, embellished, and possibly even partly fictional. But those words, once written, planted a seed that refused to die. For over 2 millennia, her name has resurfaced again and again, often in times when the world needed to remember that power doesn't always wear a crown or a beard. She has been reimagined through so many different lenses. To Renaissance Europe, she was the noble savage, a moral warning to their own tyrants. To modern Central Asia, she became a cherished folk hero, a symbol of national pride and resistance against colonial powers. But beyond all the symbolism and myth, there is something undeniably human and raw about her story. When you strip it all away, it's about a mother who lost her son. It's about a leader who was forced to choose between surrender and survival. It's about a person who, when cornered by one of the greatest powers the world had ever known, chose to fight back and won. In a world that so often erases the names of its warrior women, Tomyris persists, like a blade buried just beneath the surface, always ready to be unearthed by a new generation, hungry for stories of untamed defiance. She reminds us that history isn't just a clean, neat story of kings and empires. It's also a story of mothers and queens, of grief and revenge, of dirt and blood. It's the story of the silent moments after a battle, when a woman stands alone in a field littered with corpses, knowing that she has changed the course of the world, but will likely never be fully believed. And that, perhaps, is her greatest legacy. Her stubborn refusal to be forgotten. No statues, no problem. Her name still rides on the wind of the steppes. Her story still makes emperors look mortal. And her legend still whispers that timeless, chilling warning. Come for me, and you'll drink your fill of blood. So the next time you hear about a great king's downfall, remember that sometimes the final blow comes not from a rival empire, but from a queen on horseback, lost to history, but never truly gone. Imagine a life where your walls are made of felt, your roof is stitched from animal hide, and your front door opens onto an endless horizon. There are no cities, no permanent farms, no stone monuments to pass down to the future. There is only the rhythm of hooves, the whisper of tall grass, and the ever-changing sky. For the ancient nomadic cultures of the world, permanence was a myth, and mobility was strength. From the vast Eurasian steppes to the sands of the Arabian deserts, ancient nomads shaped entire civilizations, often without leaving a single marble temple behind. These weren't aimless, ruthless wanderers. They were strategic movers, guided by the turning of the seasons, the grazing patterns of their herds, and an intimate, almost spiritual understanding of the terrain. Their homes were masterpieces of portable engineering, yurts, black tents, or wheeled wagons, all designed for a life on the move. Cattle, sheep, goats, and most importantly, horses, were the pillars of nomadic life. A person's wealth wasn't counted in acres of land, but in heads of livestock. The horse, especially, was more than just a tool. It was a companion, a weapon, and a powerful status symbol. To ride well was to survive. To ride best was to rule. But being mobile didn't mean being disorganized. Nomadic societies had complex social structures, usually centered on clans and tribes. Power often flowed through these family lines, but leadership was frequently based on merit and influence rather than strict, unchangeable heredity. A chief or a khan might rise to power through their tactical brilliance, their skill as an orator, or their sheer, undeniable charisma. Loyalty was personal, earned in campfire councils and on wind-swept battlefields. And far from being isolated from the rest of the world, nomads were often its main connective tissue. They were the ones who moved silk from China, spices from India, and silver from Persia across vast, dangerous landscapes. Nomadic caravans and traders were the original transcontinental couriers, long before settled empires figured out how to do it efficiently. And when trade broke down, they raided. Their attacks were swift, strategic, and terrifyingly efficient. Their history wasn't written down in stone. It was sung, recited, and remembered. Elders passed down legends, genealogies, and laws through a powerful oral tradition. A tribe's entire legal system, its history, and its identity could be carried in the mind of a single bard or elder. In the eyes of the great empires, nomads were unpredictable, alien, and dangerous. But to themselves, they were the guardians of freedom, the masters of adaptation, and the rightful heirs to the wind. They left few ruins behind, but they reshaped the world every time they rode. Long before the Mongols thundered across Eurasia, the Scythians ruled the wind-swept steppe between the 9th and 2nd centuries BCE. These formidable nomadic warriors dominated the vast lands stretching from the shores of the Black Sea to the edges of Central Asia. To the ancient Greeks, they were fearsome horsemen and exotic barbarians. To themselves, they were a people of freedom, vengeance, and profound pride. Scythian society was built around two pillars, mobility and violence. Their horse culture was completely unmatched in their time. Boys learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk, and their warriors were masters of mounted combat. Their weapons were practical and deadly, short, powerful composite bows, ideal for firing a volley of arrows while galloping at full speed, short, curved swords for brutal close-quarters fighting, and heavy battle axes that could shatter a shield or a helmet. The Scythian warrior wasn't always a man, either. Archaeological finds have confirmed what Herodotus and other Greek writers hinted at. Scythian women fought, and fought well. Burial mounds across the steppe have revealed female skeletons buried with full sets of weapons, their bones showing healed wounds that could have only come from real combat. These were the historical basis for the Greek myths of the Amazons. They didn't build cities, but their kurgans, their great earthen burial mounds, have preserved their incredible legacy beneath these hills of earth. Archaeologists have unearthed treasures that defy imagination. Stunningly intricate goldwork depicting scenes of animals in combat. preserved skin showing elaborate tattoos of swirling beasts, and finely crafted garments and weapons, all buried with their chieftains to accompany them into the afterlife. But the Scythians weren't just wild raiders. They were also shrewd diplomats, mercenaries, and traders, maintaining a complex relationship with the Greek colonies that dotted the coast of the Black Sea. They sold furs, amber, slaves, and grain to the Greeks, and in return they imported fine wine, painted pottery, and other luxury goods. They were a vital link between the classical world and the deep interior of Asia. Greek writers like Herodotus were both fascinated and terrified by them. He wrote of their strange and savage customs, like drinking the blood of their first slain enemy or using the scalps of their foes as napkins. But he also praised their unshakable loyalty to their kin and their unique systems of justice. Eventually, the Scythians faded, pressured by other newer nomadic groups like the Sarmatians, and boxed in by the steady growth of settled empires. But they set the standard for the steppe warrior archetype, a mobile, deadly, and fiercely independent fighter, with no fixed home and no single master. They didn't write books, but when you picture a mounted archer silhouetted against the rising sun, that shadow is Scythian. While the Scythians ruled the vast grasslands, the Bedouins carved their legacy directly into sand. Originating in the immense and punishing deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, the Bedouin were not merely wanderers, they were masters and engineers of survival, taming some of the most inhospitable terrain on earth. Unlike the mounted thunder of the steppe nomads, Bedouin life was often quieter, more deliberate, and built around the harsh rhythms of the desert. Their life was dictated by drought and rainfall, by the location of hidden oases, and by the movements of the stars which they used to navigate the endless sea of dunes. Their home was the iconic black goat hair tent, known as the Beit al-Shur, a marvel of portable architecture that was breathable in the heat and easily packed away. Life moved with the camels, the legendary ships of the desert, which served as transport, a source of food and milk, and a measure of a family's wealth. The Bedouin were famed for their rigid tribal structure. Everything revolved around the clan, and loyalty to one's kin came before all else. Honor, or sharaf, wasn't just a word. It was the social glue that held their entire society together. A single insult could spark a blood feud that lasted for generations, but just as sacred was generosity to guests, or karam. A stranger arriving at a Bedouin tent could expect food, water, and absolute protection for 3 days, no questions asked. Their warfare was rooted in the raid, or gazu. These were fast, strategic attacks designed to capture goods and livestock without causing unnecessary bloodshed. Battle wasn't about mass slaughter. It was about survival, prestige, and honor. A successful raid elevated a man's status within the tribe. A failed one could stain a family's reputation for years. But Bedouin life wasn't all conflict and sandstorms. It was incredibly rich in oral tradition. Poets were seen as warriors of words, their verses preserving tribal history, shaming enemies, and praising the deeds of heroes. Poetry was passed down from memory to memory, often performed in a song-like cadence around the campfire. Some poems became tribal law. Others became a family's most prized legacy. Trade caravans carrying priceless incense, spices, and silk also had to pass through Bedouin lands. These tribesmen served as expert guides, protectors, and sometimes smugglers. Their knowledge of every hidden well and every star path, legendary and extremely valuable. Though many Bedouins later integrated into cities and empires, they maintained a fierce sense of identity that endures to this day. The black tent and the ancient tribal codes remain powerful symbols of their pride and their history. They weren't just survivors of the desert, they were its soul. No nomadic people have ever reshaped the world quite like the Mongols. In the 13th century, these steppe riders erupted out of the cold, harsh plains of Mongolia and, in a single generation, carved out the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But their roots were no different from the other nomadic cultures they followed. Their society was mobile, clan-based, and fiercely adaptive. Life on the Mongolian steppe was brutal and demanding. The Mongols lived in gers, circular felt tents, that could be assembled in under an hour and packed onto a cart the next morning. Their herds of horses, yaks, and goats sustained them, and their children were raised in the saddle. Riding was a skill learned long before literacy. In fact, most early Mongols couldn't read, but they didn't need to. Their knowledge was encoded in songs, proverbs, and memory. What made the Mongols different was how they weaponized their nomadic lifestyle under the unifying genius of Genghis Khan. Old tribal divisions were shattered and completely reorganized into a new merit-based military system. Loyalty to your clan was replaced by an unbreakable loyalty to the Khan himself. And with that simple radical change, the world began to tremble. Mongol warfare was a terrifying ballet of speed and deception. Their horse archers could fire with deadly accuracy at a full gallop, famously executing fake retreats to lure their enemies into devastating ambushes. Their armies could travel over 100 miles in a single day. But they weren't just mindless raiders, they were master strategists. They used networks of scouts, spies, signal flags, and psychological warfare with a precision that paralyzed their foes. And once they began conquering cities, they adapted with frightening speed. Siege engineers from China and Persia were forcibly recruited into their ranks. The Mongols, who had never seen a fortress wall they couldn't ride around, quickly learned how to build catapults, flaming arrows, and massive battering rams, and they used them with chilling efficiency. But here's the great twist of their story. They weren't just destroyers. The Mongol Empire connected the world in ways never seen before. They revived and protected the Silk Road, ensuring safe passage for merchants from China all the way to Europe. Goods, ideas, technologies, and, unfortunately, diseases like the Black Death traveled freely across their vast network. They introduced standardized paper currency, passport systems, and a surprising degree of religious tolerance across their realm. And yet, they remained nomads at heart. Even as they governed sophisticated, ancient empires, Mongol rulers often preferred their tents to palaces. They conquered cities but never truly belonged to them, because no matter how high they climbed, they always rode with the wind at their backs. To the settled empires of the world, nomads were either useful trading partners or dangerous enemies, and sometimes both on the same day. But to the nomads themselves, the line between trade and raid was always negotiable. One day, they might be escorting your valuable caravans across the desert for a handsome fee. The next, they might be plundering your border towns for supplies. It all depended on the mood, the season, and, most importantly, how well you paid. Trade was absolutely vital to the nomadic way of life. Most nomadic cultures couldn't easily grow their own grain or produce fine pottery and textiles. They needed to acquire tools, weapons, spices, and other luxury goods from their settled neighbors. In exchange, they offered the products of the steppe and desert, livestock, high-quality furs, tough leather, salt, and sometimes exotic goods like prized falcons or swift horses. Some nomadic tribes traded directly with empires, while others operated as the crucial middlemen connecting distant regions. They formed the essential links along the Silk Road, the incense route, and other great transcontinental paths. But these weren't simple merchant caravans. They were heavily armed convoys, ready to defend themselves or to attack, depending on the situation. A tribal leader might negotiate a treaty with a border governor one week, then raid his storehouses the next. Empires called this treachery. Nomads called it having options. The Scythians, for example, happily traded grain and gold to the Greek cities along the Black Sea. But if a city tried to cheat them or showed them disrespect, they would not hesitate to burn it to the ground. The Bedouins of Arabia protected the priceless incense and spice caravans, but only if the protection fees were paid. If they weren't, the camels and their cargo would simply change direction. The most famous example, of course, comes from the Mongols. Genghis Khan initially tried to establish peaceful trade relations with the powerful Khwarezmian Empire to his west. But when his merchants and ambassadors were executed by a local governor, the Mongol response was not a trade embargo. It was the complete and utter annihilation of entire cities. To the nomadic mind, trade was both personal and political. It wasn't just business, it was a reflection of respect. If a settled kingdom treated the nomads as equals, commerce thrived. If they disrespected them, the punishment was swift and usually delivered on horseback. This constant tension gave rise to a strange relationship in the border zones. Towns on the edge of nomadic lands often became hybrid spaces, half military outpost and half bustling market. This constant dance between trade and raid wasn't a flaw in nomadic life. It was one of its most essential features. It allowed them to negotiate for power without occupying territory, and to influence empires without having to build them. In a world without libraries, without scrolls or printing presses, how do you preserve your history? For the ancient nomadic cultures, the answer was simple, and yet incredibly powerful. You remember it. Oral tradition wasn't just a quaint storytelling tool for these peoples. It was their library, their courtroom, their constitution, and their sacred mythos, all rolled into one. From the Scythian grasslands to the Mongol plains and the Bedouin deserts, memory was sacred, and a well-trained tongue was sharper than any sword. Elders were more than just old men and women. They were archives in human form. They knew the intricate genealogies of their clan stretching back a dozen generations. They could recite the great war stories that shaped their tribe's identity. They were the keepers of the proverbs and wisdom that guided decisions in times of peace and battle alike. These weren't just campfire tales told for amusement. These were lessons, warnings, and laws. Among the Bedouins, poetry was king. A well-crafted verse could shame a powerful enemy, honor a fallen warrior, or settle a bitter dispute. Poets, known as sher, often served as key advisors to tribal leaders and were sometimes remembered more clearly in history than the chiefs they served. Their words could ignite a war or stop one cold, and their memories were flawless. Entire epics were passed down, word for word, from one generation to the next. The Mongols were no different. The great foundational work of their people, known as the secret history of the Mongols, was first preserved entirely through oral recitation. only being written down much later. It tells not just the story of Genghis Khan's rise to power, but also illuminates the core cultural values of loyalty, fate, revenge, and ambition that defined their world. It isn't a dry historical record. It's a living saga, originally recited by heart to teach and to unify. Even the Scythians, who left behind almost no written records of their own, maintained detailed oral accounts of their migrations, their battles, and their alliances. When Greek writers like Herodotus described their tales and their history, they were essentially capturing the faint echoes of a much older and richer spoken tradition, a history passed through campfires, not chiseled in stone. Oral tradition certainly had its risks. Memories could fade, and stories could evolve over time. But it also had one massive advantage. It lived. It was adaptable, flexible, and deeply human. It allowed nomadic societies to retain their core identity even after suffering migrations, defeats, or cultural absorption. Empires may have fallen and their stone archives turned to dust, but nomadic stories survived, not because they were written down, but because they were woven into breath, and as long as someone remembered, nothing was ever truly lost. In many ancient civilizations, women were confined to the background, silent, veiled, or restricted to the inner chambers of a palace. But in the windswept open-air world of nomadic societies, the story was often very different. On the move, everyone had to work, and that meant women frequently held positions of power, influence, and autonomy that would have been unthinkable in many settled empires. Life on the move didn't allow for idle hands. Every member of the community, regardless of gender, had to contribute to survival, warfare, and governance. Take the Scythians, for example. As we've seen, burial sites across the Eurasian steppe have revealed women buried with swords, arrows, and armor, their bones bearing the scars of combat. The Greek historians were so intrigued and terrified by this that they crafted entire myths about the Amazons, fierce warrior women supposedly descended from these nomadic tribes. In Mongol society, women were the backbone of the empire, while the men were away on long campaigns of conquest. It was the women who managed the vast encampments, controlled the herds, and raised the next generation of warriors. But even at the highest levels of power, Mongol women left their mark. Genghis Khan's daughters and daughters-in-law often ruled vast territories, led armies into battle, and conducted high-stakes diplomacy. One of the most powerful women in all of Mongol history, Sorghutani Beki, was a brilliant strategist and kingmaker who raised 4 sons who would all become emperors. Among the Bedouins, women had fewer public leadership roles, but they still wielded immense influence through poetry, family alliances, and the sacred traditions of hospitality. A woman's tent was her domain. Her ability to manage resources, uphold the family's honor, and raise future warriors made her a central figure in tribal life. In some tribes, women could even initiate divorce, control their own property, and own camels, the ultimate symbol of wealth and survival. Religion also gave nomadic women a path to spiritual authority. In various Turkic and Siberian steppe cultures, female shamans played crucial roles as healers, spirit guides, and keepers of ancestral wisdom. They weren't seen as fringe mystics. They were respected pillars of the community whose guidance was sought by chiefs and commoners alike. In short, the harsh necessity of nomadic life often created a more egalitarian society. The unpredictable nature of their world demanded flexibility. If a man fell in battle, A woman had to be ready to step up without ceremony and without asking for permission. In these wind-swept societies, a woman could be the hand that rocked the cradle and the hand that drew the bow. For nomadic peoples, spirituality was not something you found inside a temple or a sacred building. It was woven into the fabric of the land, the vastness of the sky, and the rhythm of the journey itself. When your entire life is in constant motion, your gods must ride with you. Their belief systems were typically animistic and deeply rooted in the cycles of the seasons, the behavior of animals, and the raw struggle for survival. The wind wasn't just weather, it was a messenger from the heavens. Mountains weren't just geography, they were powerful guardians. Rivers didn't just carry water, they carried spirits. And the fire at the center of the camp wasn't just for warmth, it was sacred. Life for a nomad was a constant dialogue with this unseen, spiritual landscape. The Scythians, as described by Herodotus, worshipped a pantheon of gods tied directly to the natural world, including a goddess of the hearth and a powerful sky god. Their rituals were visceral and earthy, sometimes involving horse sacrifice and, famously, the ritual use of cannabis smoke to communicate with the spirit world. There were no priests in elaborate robes, just warriors and shamans calling directly to the open heavens. The Bedouins, before the rise of Islam, practiced a form of polytheism centered around local deities and tribal idols. But above all, they revered the unseen and mysterious forces of fate and nature. Spirits known as jinn were believed to dwell in rocks, in windstorms, and in lonely desert places. Poets and seers were thought to be inspired, or sometimes even possessed, by these powerful entities. In Mongol culture, the spiritual world was structured around Tengrism, the worship of Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Tengri wasn't a god you prayed to in a temple. He was the sky itself, ever-present, all-seeing, and the ultimate judge of human affairs. Genghis Khan himself claimed his divine right to rule came directly from Tengri. The Mongols also revered earth spirits, ancestral ghosts, and the sacred fire that burned at the center of every tent. Shamanism played a vital role across many of these cultures. Shamans were the healers, the spirit guides, and often the political advisors. They were the intermediaries between the physical world and the vast, unseen spiritual realm. The true beauty of nomadic spirituality was its adaptability. As these cultures came into contact with Buddhists, Muslims, and Christians, they often blended these new beliefs with their own ancient traditions. Their faith was as fluid as the rivers they crossed. Whereas cities built great cathedrals to contain the divine, nomads carried the sacred with them. Their faith didn't need four walls, just the sky above, the earth below, and memory in between. They didn't leave behind pyramids or cathedrals. You won't find the ruins of their great capitals on most modern maps. And yet, the legacy of the ancient nomadic cultures is written all over the pages of history. In the flow of trade, in the scars of conquest, and even in the languages we speak today, nomads were not historical footnotes. They were the architects of disruption, reshaping entire continents through the simple power of movement. That Silk Road we talked about, it wasn't just a route for silk and spices. It was a highway built by hooves, maintained by the diplomacy, the muscle, and the local knowledge of countless nomadic tribes. Without them, the worlds of the East and the West might never have truly met. The great empires of the world feared them, and for good reason. The Scythians, the Xiongnu, the Turks, and the Mongols all challenged the long-held myth of urban superiority. Their victories on the battlefield exposed a fundamental truth: mobility can outthink monuments. Where settled empires moved slowly, nomads adapted. Where cities relied on walls, nomads relied on speed. But their influence wasn't only military. They acted as the world's great cultural bridges, carrying music, recipes, stories, and even religions from one civilization to another. Mongol rule brought Chinese printing technology and gunpowder to the West. Arab, Bedouin traditions of honor and poetry deeply shaped the early Islamic world. And Turkish nomads laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the mighty Ottoman Empire. The paths they rode became the arteries of civilization. And even after their great empires faded, their spirit endured. You can still see it today in the traditions of horsemanship, in cultures that value oral storytelling, and in the deep importance placed on kinship, resilience, and independence that still echoes across the steppe, the desert, and the tundra. In many ways, they also serve as a warning. They remind us that no structure is truly permanent, not even the grandest empire. They proved that the wind could erase borders, and that power didn't need to be carved in stone to be real. So when you study history, don't just look at the great walls, the temples, and the thrones. Look in the spaces between them. That's where the nomads lived, and that's where history moved. Thank you for joining me on this long journey tonight through medieval courtship. I hope you found a bit of peace and quiet in these stories from the past. If you enjoyed our time together, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes. It truly helps the channel continue to bring you these histories for sleep. Until next time, I wish you a calm and restful night.